Thank you for your attention to VICH Guidelines of Environmental Impact Assessment for Veterinary Medicinal Products, VMP. In the video program, it will introduce some outlines of environmental risks of VMPs and the guidelines to control such risks in Japan. VMPs are indispensable for treating livestock or companion animals. VMPs are used not only for livestock but also in aquaculture. Adequate VMP use contributes to public health, efficient, safe and stable food supply, and animal welfare. However, VMPs are also chemical substances, and at some point in time, the administered VMPs are discharged into the environment. In this point, VMPs pose the same problems as other industrial chemicals. Generally, the amount of VMPs discharged into the environment is relatively smaller than that of ordinary industrial and agricultural chemicals. But VMPs are essentially bioactive chemicals. Although fortunately a critical environmental accident involving VMPs has not yet occurred, risk analysis and management might be indispensable. This is the outline of the program. Firstly, it will be discussed the fate of VMPs after excretion. This is the discharge route of VMPs to the environment in the case of their use for livestock. Administered VMPs are absorbed in animals, metabolized, and finally excreted with feces or urine. In Japan, livestock farming is highly integrated, so livestock waste is divided in the liquid and solid portions, treated and released to the ground. It is forbidden by law to dump untreated livestock waste. Finally, it is considered that undegraded VMPs reach aquatic environments. Some VMPs used in pasture are discharged to the environment directly. This is the discharge route in the case of VMP use for aquaculture. Compared with the case of livestock, it is often the case that VMPs are discharged to the environment without treatment. This point is considered in Environmental Impact Assessment Guidelines, which will be mentioned later. Secondly, it will be introduced the regulations for VMPs. This table shows the list of laws governing the use of chemicals in agriculture, stock breeding and aquaculture in Japan. VMPs are governed by the law on securing quality, efficacy and safety of products including pharmaceuticals and medical devices, which is abbreviated as LPMD. LPMD also governs the use of drugs for humans. This is the flow chart from application to approval for a new VMP. NVAL checks the data and summarizes critical information. Afterward, the external council organized by various specialists evaluates the VMP, and MAFF decides whether to approve the new VMP or not on the basis of the findings of the evaluation. In the case of a new VMP for animals that are later consumed as food, MAFF consults with the Ministry of Health, Labor and Welfare about the maximum residue level for the VMP, as well as the Food Safety Commission regarding the acceptable daily intake. A generic VMP is evaluated by NVAL, and MAFF decides whether to approve it or not. These are the categories of data required for new drug application. You can see the large amount of data required for proving that the VMP being applied for approval satisfies the three essential requirements: safety, efficacy and quality. Well, to which category do you think the data on environmental safety would belong? Toxicity? The answer will be shown later. Next, it will be introduced the regulations on environmental issues on VMPs. First, several criteria for rejecting the application of a new VMP are defined in LPMD. If we find that the VMP meets the criteria, we should reject the application. Unfortunately, ecotoxicity is not among the criteria. Moreover, the data on environmental safety are not officially required. It is assumed that the reason is to balance the necessity among clinical fields. In fact, It is a very serious problem to consider whether the application of a clinically indispensable drug should be rejected because it poses a risk of environmental toxicity. Well, how about other laws to protect environment? Unfortunately again, drugs are beyond the scope of most of such Japanese laws. Actually, VMP industries practice self-regulation on environmental safety. The Guideline on Self-Regulation is published by the Japan Veterinary Products Association, JVPA, and it is based on the VICH Guideline. Next, it will be introduced the Guideline of Environmental Impact Assessment of VMPs. A typical EIA method is exhibited in the flowchart. PNEC is estimated by a toxicity test, and PEC is estimated by surveillance of production and waste volume. To determine whether a new VMP requires risk management or not, the ratio of PEC to PNEC is calculated. As you know, conventional EIA is often used for various chemicals. The VICH EIA guidelines are also based on conventional EIA, but also have some original points. This is how PNEC is calculated. At OECD, I'm involved in the investigation of high production volume chemicals to determine reference values. For this investigation, 3 basic tests are conducted, which are the same as those in the VICH guidelines, but other tests can be used in the VICH guidelines in an early step. OECD investigations are mainly concerned with aquatic ecosystems, whereas VICH guidelines also include terrestrial ecosystems as basic targets. As an additional characteristic of VICH guidelines, application factors are defined in each study in the guidelines. The scope of VICH guidelines is shown here. The targets include most VMPs. Biological products are beyond the scope of the guidelines. The environments to be saved are indicated in the guidelines, namely, all places excluding livestock and aquaculture facilities. These facilities are regulated by other laws and guidelines. The definition of the term harmful seems to be no different from its standard definition. These guidelines include evaluation and test methods, but several regional factors are indispensable for evaluation. Such factors are specified by relevant authorities. Moreover, antimicrobial resistance and endocrine disruptors are also beyond the scope of the guidelines. The VICH guidelines are outlined in this slide. The guidelines consist of 2 phases. Phase 1 involves VMP screening of VMP, which requires various study data for evaluation. Phase 2 have 2 parts. For evaluation on Tier A, a relatively simple data set is used. More data are used for evaluation on Tier B, and some endpoints are different from those on Tier A. It will be explained each phase in the next slide. For Phase 1, a decision tree is used for evaluation. It is made up of 19 questions on how to use a VMP, indication of use for target animal species, amount of use in the region and predicted environmental concentration calculated from such information. A laboratory study is not required at Phase 1. Finally, a VMP, whose predicted environmental concentration is above a cutoff value, requires a Phase 2 study. The conditions or factors that may require a Phase 2 study of a VMP are summarized here. A VMP used in large quantities in a region and discharged into the environment directly is assumed to have higher risk to the environment. Well, 2 threshold values are described in Phase 1 guidelines, which were based on research reports and determined by agreement among technical experts in the VICH working group for establishing the guidelines. This is the flowchart of Phase 2. Phase 2 have 2 tiers. As mentioned in the previous slide, the evaluation requires several study data in each tier. In addition, 3 branches are included in the evaluation scheme, namely, aquaculture, intensively reared terrestrial animals, and pasture animals. A decision tree is also included in each branch. The reason why Phase 2 has 2 tiers is to reduce the assessment cost and time. The required studies at Tier A are fewer and simpler than those in Tier B. Thus, no excess cost and time are spent for VMPs with a lower risk. It is necessary not to stop further assessment or take some risk management measures even at Tier 2. The measures are beyond the scope of the VICH guidelines because such assessments or adequate measures differ from region to region. This is the flow of assessment in Phase 2. In the assessment, PEC, PNEC, log KOW and BCF as endpoints. The pink dialog boxes are decision points. If the calculated value satisfies the criteria, the assessment is stopped. At Tier A, evaluation is based on a relatively rough calculation so as to suppose the worst case. The evaluation does not stop at an early step, and the value should be more critical in the following step. Further assessment and risk management are the responsibility of each region or country government, as it was mentioned earlier. In this slide, the studies required in Phase 2 are summarized. The explanation for these studies is omitted because their procedures are generally known, as indicated in the OECD guidelines for the testing of chemicals. The VICH guidelines were established by the VICH Expert Working Group and authorized VICH Steering Committee in 2000 and 2004. You can see the complete guidelines on the VICH homepage. Although the Japanese guidelines are not a regulatory authority, the guidelines have been enforced as self-regulation of industry. In the evaluation of a new VMP in Japan, these data are not considered essential data as it was mentioned earlier. If the data can be submitted to a regulatory authority, the data are attached as origin or discovery of a drug. For the approved VMP, NVAL collect the literature of its environmental risk and evaluate it in the re-examination and re-evaluation. Finally, it shall be introduced NVAL briefly. The studies of VMPs and NVAL are mostly technical in nature, for example, National Assay of Biological Products, VMP evaluation for approval, quality check of distributed VMPs and VMP residue in food. In addition, we have investigated related issues including the environmental safety of VMPs. You can also contact me on our homepage. If you have any question about VMP issues, please don't hesitate to ask me. Thank you very much.